I am so happy today, just joyful today to be here with Esther Meek, who I first talked to a couple of years ago. And this time we're hoping that we can put this on the internet for everybody else to watch. Welcome, Esther. Good to have you.
Welcome. I mean, hello. You're welcome.
Welcome. I want to tell my viewers a little bit about your background so that they know who they're going to be. I mean, most of my viewers probably already know about you, but Esther is a philosopher, and right now she's the Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Geneva College, but writing full-time. Geneva is in Western Pennsylvania. She's also a fellow scholar with the Fujimura Institute with artist Makoto Fujimura, who's an associate fellow with the Kirby Lang Center for Public Theology. And she's also a member of the Polanyi Society. And Esther, you've written a number of books. I know that you wrote Longing to Know and Loving to Know and Contact with Reality. And the one that I have just finished reading, A Little Manual for Knowing.
Congratulations.
And I've listened to a number of your lectures. And I was listening to the one that you did on art and the crossover between art and your theories of knowing. And that's so interesting because that's what got me thinking about you in the first place, because I started with this channel with an exploration of how art overlaps with science and philosophy and faith and knowing, because listening to Jordan Peterson a lot, when he talks about order and chaos, he's basically talking about the known and the unknown. And so through that exploration of the known and the unknown with Jordan Peterson, I got onto Iain McGilchrist and was having a number of conversations on my channel about Iain McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, when somebody contacted me and said, you should learn about Esther Meek because she fits right in this spot, and that you're also tied up with Michael Polanyi's work. So then I thought, wow, okay, we have a terrific overlap there. So before we start into the whole covenant epistemology discussion, though, I was hoping to ask you a personal question. And you've mentioned in a number of your talks that when you were a young person, you had these deep questions about, you know, is there a God? How do I know there's a God? How do I know that reality exists? And I know that drove your pursuit then of these questions and got you into the whole arena of philosophy and epistemology. But I'd like to take you back to that time when you were thinking those thoughts. Can you kind of tell me what was going on in your life at that point and how it impacted you to start exploring those deep questions? I mean, just emotionally, did it affect your relationships with people?
That's a wonderful question. I was 13, so I don't remember much, but I would say two things happened. One was, and I do tell a good portion of this story in Loving to Know, that I grew up thinking I wasn't noticed. I don't want to blame anybody. It could well have just been my perception. Mm-hmm. But that was a much later realization in my life. But then I think another thing that was happening, and I'm thinking this really prompted by my recent study of Charlotte Mason's work. I'm doing a collaboration with someone on a monograph in honor of her centenary next year. And, I think the other problem was modern education, that would have started to kick in when I was 6. And, but I would say those might have been occasions, but the problem was that a Cartesian outlook is in the water of modernity. I mean, nobody taught me it, but to me, it was the most obvious thing in the world. I didn't hear it at church. I didn't hear it at school.
Well, no, it's just the water we swim in. I mean, to get out of that water is a long.
So I was swimming, and then another way it came to expression was later when I was trying to decide what to major in college, and I thought, well, chemistry, I like chemistry, I'm good at it, but I looked at that scientific method and I thought, there's no way I can do this. I can't be a scientist because there's no way I could generate tentative hypotheses. Well, the problem wasn't me; it was the scientific method. But
let's explore that a minute. You said there was no way you could generate tentative hypotheses. Why did you feel that way?
Well, I struggled with a lot of self-doubt. That would be one thing. But
you mean you felt that you weren't going to be creative enough to come up with tentative hypotheses?
Correct. Okay. Yeah, and I also felt that there was an inherent contradiction in the scientific method. It was presuming a view of, of course, I didn't know this at the time. It took me a while to figure it out, but, took reading Polanyi to see that if you're going to be, adding up data in a linear way, generating a hypothesis doesn't make any sense. So anyway, I just thought I couldn't do it.
Because that would require everything to be a horizontal causation in essence.
Something like that.
Yeah. So I'm going to be talking next week to Wolfgang Smith, who's a physicist. I feel really privileged to have the opportunity to talk to him because he's 92 years old, but he's written a number of books and he's come up with a theory just in the last decade or so of his life that he calls vertical causation, because he says this horizontal causation just doesn't function in reality, and it doesn't function even with quantum physics. So
Polanyi's idea that I've taken into my own work, that all knowing is from to integration. I think integration is a great word for saying that what has primacy is the to, not the from, which means you're doing this kind of backward scrabbling that you hope will be graced from without. Polanyi understood that you've got to defend irreducibility and the verticality. Actually, I just wrote a post on verticality.
Interesting. Well, and the irreducibility is fascinating too, because we've done a lot of work on this channel about Stephen Wolfram's new theory of fundamental physics. Have you heard of that? And one of Stephen Wolfram's big things that he pounds on all the time is computational irreducibility and irreducible complexity, both of those things, which fits right into the whole thing of indefinite future manifestations.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, we're getting a little bit too far in the weeds right now, because I kind of want to take things in order for people who don't have the background of your work. And one of the ways I thought we might do that is I received a question in an email today that made me think about just a lot of this, the younger generation right now, especially I would say the millennial generation and Generation Z. There are quite a few that struggle with this same kind of a problem. So let me flesh this out just a little bit. So this particular person said that they're plagued with a sense of hopelessness and despair, as if there are no future possible indefinite future manifestations available to this person. Never able to make very good contact with the reality of my circumstances and opportunities. I can only conceive of one potential future, which is loneliness, abandonment, and despair.
Oh, gee.
And as I was reading that, I thought of a number of other young people that I know that are struggling with this exact same thing. And partly because all the time they're growing up, they get the idea that the unknown is scary and bad because maybe their parents overprotect them or their parents themselves are struggling with anxiety. And so that's kind of the primary message that some parents communicate. And I can actually think of myself, because I was an older mother, having a child at the age of 46, and I was very protective. So I think when you overprotect, it's possible for people not to have enough contact with anomaly and chaos and problems to understand that there is a way to work through them, and there is a way to find your way to the other side, which is this whole, in a way, the process of knowing is the same as the process of living, right? It's the same adventure, right? It's an adventure. The way Jordan Peterson would put it is you have to be willing to become friends with the unknown rather than with the known, because the unknown is where all the possibilities lie. And that ties right into your indefinite future manifestations work. So I wondered if you might have anything to say to young people that are feeling that way.
Oh, that's incredible. That's an incredible question. Well, first of all, I think I want to say that I'm an epistemologist, and I feel as if we all have lots of problems, and a good number of them, or a significant piece of them, can be epistemological, and that's what I feel equipped to deal with. But there's lots of other stuff in life, right? Mm-hmm. Now all those things can be interconnected. And for me, it was epistemological. And even if it had been something else, it had to be epistemological. That's what I was dealing with. I'm not sure about how I feel about the known and the unknown, because I love the idea of the yet to be known, which is what I think the indefinite future manifestations are.
Wouldn't that be a part of the unknown?
I think there's a difference of posture there. And I do think we're talking about the posture of hope as opposed to the posture of control, fear, suspicion, da-da-da. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I think that we have epistemological issues in modernity, and I think we've got metaphysical ones too, in that we struggle to trust the real, which is, I think, what the comment is reflecting. And I think a real can really grow out the biology we've inherited. But I think
okay, Esther, you just said something very important, but you froze right in the middle of it.
Oh, no. And I'm getting a sign saying my internet connection is unstable. Does that mean I need to close some things here? Let's close down some other things I've got open on my computer. What do you think?
Yes, and I'll close some things I've got on my computer too, just in case it's coming from my side.
Let's see, what else can I close? Let's close this. Not that I think that's taken it. Oh, I lost you. Are you there?
Okay, I'm here.
All right, good. All right, well, maybe that'll help. All right. Now, what was I saying?
Well, you were saying that we struggle to trust the real.
Yeah.
And then you started to elaborate on that. And it sounded like you were saying something that was very pertinent. So I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose that.
Well, if you look back at my 13-year-old questions, which were, how do I know? And see that I was a child skeptic, right? Mm-hmm. Skepticism is about knowing, but it's also about distrust of the real. And I do feel as if we have inherited a posture of distrust. If you just think of, I'm presuming you're familiar with Descartes' modernity shaping picture thought experiment.
Well, it never hurts to replay that in different ways for people. We have talked about it a number of times, but I still think it's such a central part of the problem that we deal with today that I think it's good to look at it from a lot of different sides. So go ahead.
I don't know about a lot of different sides, but the heart of it is a posture of suspicion, a posture of methodical doubt, which is a posture of guilty until proven innocent, as far as reality is concerned. And he was in search of an Archimedean point of certainty, which he found arrogantly in himself, totally disregarding all the complications therein. But and so we have postured ourselves in suspicion of the real. So that,
I mean, wouldn't you say that in a way that's nothing new? Because isn't that the whole problem of the garden? That Eve was.
You could read it in there, but I think there's some other things going on there too.
Okay, so we won't muddy the waters then.
I can say this: we don't need modernity to get assumptions to kind of follow out that sort of thinking, but it is endemic in modernity.
Yes.
So it's like modernity is the particular issue version of it that we in fact struggle with.
Well, it has certainly colonized our way of thinking about things and requires some epistemic therapy, as you put it. Right. So you were saying, I'm sorry I derailed you. You were saying that with Descartes, there was a suspicion and methodical doubt, and he was in search of a certainty and found it in himself.
Yeah, as over against the real outside his head. So that's the picture. That's the picture, that the vision that defines modernity, I think. As another 20th century philosopher said, a picture held us captive. That picture held us captive, still does.
So something in that search took you to Polanyi. Was Polanyi the first person that you found that kind of helped you get some clarity on that?
Finding Polanyi's work was key. It took me years to grow into what I was developing. Even after I wrote my dissertation, which came out as Contact with Reality in an updated form more recently. But when I first had written the dissertation in 1983, I still wasn't convinced. So I really feel, and I do say this in the updated version of Contact with Reality, it's like a body shift, a gradual body shift that you have to undergo. And so that you get from distrusting to trusting the real. And I would say hope versus despair is just tied up in that. So whatever else is going on in a person's life, there can be this epistemological factor. D.C. Schindler in his book Love and the Postmodern Predicament talks about just this deep level despair that characterizes our milieu. And I would say, do you know the word acedia?
I did run into it just recently, but it was in D.C. Schindler's book, because I'm about a third of the way through Love and the Postmodern Predicament. Okay. But the meaning of it escapes me right now. Remind me.
Well, one of the 7 deadly sins. But philosopher Joseph Pieper defines that as the refusal to consent to being or to the real. And one thing that distinguishes humans from other critters is we have this option to be authentic or not, and we have this option to say yes or not. And so our lives ought to live out a yes to being. You have to consent And you can see some people that are living out a big no, but I think modernity is a no. It's a refusal to consent to the real. And so in that posture of a no, of course you're cut off.
Well, it's so interesting that you're here today, because today is when I get this letter, and today is the next episode after the previous episode, which was all about the option to consent and to say yes to being and to say yes to reality, which came about through an entirely different arena, the arena of art, because I was speaking to an artist, and she had been exploring the whole story of Mary through her art and Mary's consent and Mary's saying yes.
Radical consent.
Yes, saying
as
yes.
As opposed to Zechariah's suspicion. Mm-hmm. How do I know?
Yeah.
I mean, they ask the same question from a different posture.
Well, and Mary was being asked not only to a mental assent, but to a complete embodiment, right? Yeah. So
being impregnated by the Holy Spirit.
When you're talking about hope, what do you mean when you say hope?
How about sense of possibilities? You know, that there's options and a prospect of good. And I would say it ought to be the case that a prospect of good is embedded in our sense of the real, it being a transcendental. So if that's not happening, then something's awry. Now, I guess I'll stop.
Well, I would love to see you talk to Jordan Peterson. And this was where you and I began 2 years ago, was me trying to tell you about Jordan Peterson. And here's the reason I'd like to farther. Here's the reason I would like to have you talk to Jordan Peterson, and that is because his whole thing is that that we have to come to a place of acknowledging, and it's the hardest thing that we can do, to acknowledging that being is good. Now, he's coming at this from outside traditional Christian faith, but his idea of how to live a meaningful life and how to how to live a meaningful life is to fix your eyes on the most the highest good of which you can conceive. Look at this thing above the horizon, fix your eyes on that, and that when you do that, into the periphery of your vision will come all of these. He doesn't call them indefinite future manifestations, but he says into your vision will come these things that you need in order to follow this little thing that glimmers out in front of you that's calling you forward.
Sounds like clues.
Yes, exactly. It sounds exactly like the whole subsidiary focal integration of the work that you've done, following after, that was inspired by Michael Polanyi. And it sounds like, so he has come to these conclusions through his study of the great catastrophes of the 20th century, fascism and communism, and the necessity of abandoning ideology and moving away from this idea of, rather than knowledge being an adventure, knowledge became this crystallized thing that is hardened in a box, and that you can only fit inside this box or that box, and how deadly that can be in the way that it affects humanity. And so he's trying to talk to people about when he says make friends with the unknown, he's basically talking about this idea that outside this world of order that we're in, there are times when we fall into chaos, we fall into the unknown. We can either voluntarily confront the unknown, or we can involuntarily fall into the unknown. And either way, there are things that can be learned when we're in there. Mm-hmm. And so I've done a number of conversations with people where we talk about kind of the interfacing of love and suffering and anomaly, and how these work in our lives. And I just think that you have a lot to bring into the conversation with Jordan Peterson. I would love to see a conversation between the two of you.
Lovely. Well, I've made it to to John Vervaeke's show. So
I don't see why you say I've made it. What really has happened is that you stumbled into our little corner of the internet. Because I mean, obviously your work is very seminal work in this field and highly regarded, and I'm sure that you're, I mean, anyway, you know what I'm trying to say. I don't know why. I think you're teasing when you say that. When you say I've made it, as far as conversation.
Well, that's really not for me to judge. So I'm happy to hear from you.
So one of the things that you said was that Polanyi's realism proves to be its own justification and is perhaps the only realism worthy of the designation. So when you're talking about realism in that way, what do you mean?
I've used it as simply in philosophy, realism has to do with whether there's a world independent of my knowing it. And a realist says yes, and an anti-realist says no. So, and we tend post Descartes to be anti-realist, and in all different flavors, positivism and subjectivism, and sociology of knowledge, and all those kinds of things. But and it's been a while since I reread the end of Contact with Reality, which is, I think, where you're getting that. The sense that reality turns the tables and walks into our lives.
Yeah, that's where I was hoping you would go with this. So yeah, keep going.
It's like it doesn't exactly need for me to prove it. And if I'm holding a skeptical stance, it's really there's really something ludicrous about that. I don't know if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, but those dwarves, their studied myopia. There's just really something arrogant about that. However, I don't at all want to be dismissive and say that we don't struggle with that, because I have. I spent a lot of my life distrusting the real. And now, actually, even the last month, I've started to say to myself, I need to apologize for my sins, because I've missed out on so much of reality because of that. But that doesn't mean.
Well, so when you speak about the impact that it has to be skeptical of the real, it sounds, and I think there is something here that's not only metaphysical, but physical. It's as though we're putting up a boundary that's keeping anything from coming into us, which there could be a lot of reasons why people put up boundaries. Sometimes I think when a person is really deep in suffering, they're afraid to let down the boundary because they're afraid that some more suffering is going to come in and it's just going to be too much and overload the boat, right?
But I would disagree in that, I want to hold out for there being something epistemological here. It doesn't reduce to neuroscience or bodily whatever. You still have the philosophical issue, and the philosophical issue is worth spending a life addressing, which is what I'm doing. So, I mean, it does intertwine with physical things and emotional and all of that, but it shouldn't be reduced to them.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because that's a very interesting concept, that talking about personal experience over against philosophy is reducing a thing. Is that what you're saying? I'm
saying it could be.
Okay, well, tell me more about that. I think that's really an interesting idea.
Well, my problems as a child, they were philosophical. Whatever else was going on with me bodily, I had to address the philosophical question. And I've found that addressing the philosophical question in its turn has helped in other ways. So they just, they're obviously intertwined, but it's important to see that there's this philosophical component.
Well, maybe for some people, just understanding how you're differentiating philosophy from all the other aspects of our lives would be helpful. When you say philosophy, I mean, are you defining that as a study of wisdom, the love of wisdom, the love of knowledge, a relationship with wisdom? When you say philosophy, what are you getting at there?
Well, those are our fundamental tacit commitments concerning what's real, how we understand it, what we're to do with it, and who we are. So those are matters that every step we take reflects some sort of response to, and those are philosophical questions, and they're fundamental. That doesn't mean we necessarily come to them first, but
you had 4. What's real? How to understand it?
What we're to do with it?
What we're to do with it?
Who we are. So those are metaphysics, epistemology, metaethics or ethics, and philosophical anthropology. Those are the 4 arenas of philosophy. And my approach is to say, look, you don't have to have a philosophy course to be philosophical. You have to be born to be philosophical. And philosophizing is unavoidable, and it's also our birthright. So one of the sins of modernity is to disavow philosophy. It's an anti-philosophical philosophy, which is inherently contradictory.
So this is so interesting, but so I'm trying to understand something for myself. I'm not questioning anything that you're saying. I'm just trying to nail this down inside my own head. One of Jordan Peterson's books, the big one that he wrote about the same time that you were thinking about these things back in the 80s, he wrote a book called Maps of Meaning. And in that Maps of Meaning, he sets out 4 things at the beginning that are very similar to your 4 things, not exactly the same. But he makes the argument in Maps of Meaning that the world is not a place of objects, but a forum for action. And
that's nice. I like that.
Yeah, he's very opposed to scientism that turns into reductionist, materialist view of the world. But at the same time, because he's a psychologist, he is very much on the science train. And you might say in a lot of things that he is, if psychology is reducing from philosophy, you might say in a lot of things he is reducing to psychology some of these ideas. But he also talks a lot about philosophy and all of that. And anyway, you like that idea that rather than a place of objects, it's a forum for action. Because, I mean, that really does fit in with the whole idea of integrating these subsidiaries into our being. And then that's an important aspect of knowing. So one of the things that I really liked about your work when I first started reading about it is that I'm an artist, and I have had this idea for a long time that the well, it's a big idea. Anyway, one of the things that I do in my art is that I like to work with chaos. And so I create a lot of chaos on the canvas. And then I spend some time looking at it and I see, is there anything that I see there that would help me move forward on the path? And that sounds a lot to me like this idea of the subsidiaries. That's part of the idea of the subsidiaries. Another part of it is that I can read about painting, I can watch videos about painting, I can learn about painting from somebody else. But until I paint, until I actually move my hands and coordinate my hands with my brain and with my thoughts and with the vision that I have for the painting and all of that kind of stuff, nothing is going to happen. And all of those are subsidiaries. But it isn't until I get to know my canvas as I'm working. So I start out with an idea, but then I also have to get to know, and I come to a place where I want to despair of my painting and throw it out because it's so darn ugly. And at that point, I have to stop and say to my painting, in spite of all this, I still love you. And I'm still going to pursue until I get some resolution here, until I get to know you, and we can have a happy ending.
That's lovely. That's what I'm trying to write about right now in my book on artistry.
So tell me more about that.
Well, let me go back to the, yes, I will. But let me go back to the Peterson comment about a forum for action, which that's great. But I also want to, what I'm working to do is replace the word object with the word things. Mm-hmm. I know that sounds really weird, but I'm trying to develop my own metaphysics right now, and trying to offer a metaphysics of a lively real. And so I want to see things as having all the qualities about them that the classic metaphysicians said, thing being the first transcendental, and good, true, and beautiful being some of the transcendentals, but also given this idea of indeterminate future manifestations, and the classical idea of lively being. I'm putting those together. So when you're dealing with a thing, you're dealing with a lively something or other who is wanting to make itself known to you, and so is looking to you to open that out. And as I think about artistry, it seems to me that artists, or anybody making anything, treat with integrity as things, both their materials and their half understood vision.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Which you just, I think, said. So to be an artist is to love and trust yourself to the stuff you work with. And yet also you love and trust the vision that you are trying to work toward, but you haven't yet understood. And so that's Polanyi's From, To, and Beyond, that posture is you're leaning in to trust both of them. So you keep your eye out there, that's Polanyi and his intuition, and then you subsidiarily, imaginatively scrabble here, that's Polanyi and imagination. And it's going on like that all the time.
Well, and with the materials, you have to get to know each one of your materials intimately, right? And so that whole process is going on with the material as well, and then the whole picture as well. And then for me, I also learned a kind of a process of a way of thinking about how to know whether or not I am getting closer to the vision. And that was a way of thinking about the elements and principles of art, which are something that they're not made up by anybody, but they were sort of discovered over the millennia as how do you look at a piece of art and how do you understand what is causing it to be beautiful or enticing. And that is that there are these elements. I mean, they've been described different ways by people, but the way I learned them was line, size, shape, direction, color, value, and texture. And those show up in every work of art. They actually show up in poetry and in music as well as in graphic art. But then each of those is also kind of operated on through these ways of finding indefinite future manifestations, which would be the 8 principles, which are unity, harmony, contrast, dominance, repetition, variation, gradation, and balance.
Wow.
So
if you'll
each,
please write those lists down and
yes,
send
I
me,
will.
like
So
that.
each of those creates a sort of a pole, a polar unity, right? So you can have all the way from light to dark in the area of value. You can have repetition all the way from identical repetition to non-identical repetition. You can have gradation that goes all the way from just very, gradation can be, you can grade from one color to another, or you can grade from one size to another. So all of these things work together when you're working on a painting, but you can't think about them while you're painting.
You indwell them.
Yeah, you have to integrate them into your being, and then while you're painting, you're free to paint. Once in a while, you can stop and step back and say, "Okay, how am I doing? Am I including enough here so that every square inch becomes delicious and meaningful?" And right, and at the same time find the unity in the final product. But inside of all of that, there are a few basics that are so essential, and part of that is part of the process. And that process involves, for me, it involves starting out with some very tight constraint, setting up some limits for myself, which kind of springboard my creativity, because necessity is the mother of invention. So if anything is possible, you can't do anything. I think that's one reason our children struggle.
Yeah,
they've been told for such a long time, anything is possible. Well, right. Then how do I know what direction to go?
And it also, that's oppressive too, because and it's not true to the material. I mean, if you think of your child as the materials of your work of art, you may not use them for something they're not meant to be used for,
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
you want to confer dignity on the materials. I don't know if that makes, if that's
it totally makes sense, because what it means is you have to know your child, and you have to know what their they may have some limitations that you don't want to focus on, but at the same time, you don't want to build up in them expectations that are so unrealistic that there's no,
you burden them with them.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a tremendous burden.
Are you of an age to remember the film version of Cinderella called Ever After?
Was that Drew Barrymore?
What's that?
Was that Drew Barrymore?
Yes.
Okay.
And Prince Henry was a mess. And at one point in there, he finally gets it. And he says, I used to think I had to do everything. And it was like driving me crazy. But now I've found my purpose, he said, and I've found the most wonderful freedom. And the women in his life were saying to him, you were born to, what was it? You were born to greatness, and with it comes specific responsibility, So the idea that you can do anything, which would be a pretty damning lie of modernity, And I actually, thinking about artists and that sort of a thing, it seems like, thinking back to the person who wrote the question to you today, you want to find the things in your life that you do trust, and they are near to you. There's a lot of things that you trust, but you got to sometimes look for them. If you're going to play video games, you got to be good with your fingers. You know what I'm saying? So, or, if you were to, take to yourself a project of growing some zinnias in a little plot of dirt, maybe that's a kind of a pulling into the near to see that you live into the real. You push on it. And part of what's happened in modernity is we've gotten this ocular distance, me in here, whatever it is out there far from me. Whereas, if you think of Descartes and his thought experiment, all the things that he's putting out there that he's presuming, like language. Where to get his language? Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, language is in here, so we trust ourselves to our language. We lean into it, just like you have to give yourself to a bike if you're going to ride it. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing to ride a bike. It's lovely.
So the leaning in, when you were talking about gardening, what aspect of gardening would you say is the leaning in?
Well, one of the things I would have to do is trust some gardeners around me to tell me what to do. That's the authoritative guide. And I think your 8 or your 2 lists of several, some of those are normative guidelines, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you have to operate in an indwelling way from,
mm-hmm.
right? So I would have to find, authoritative guides to tell me what the dirt ought to look like, how far down to put the seed, how much to water. If I were not a gardener at all to begin with, I would have to do a whole lot of listening to other people. So at the beginning of a venture, the venture often is entirely the word of the authoritative guide that you have to entrust yourself to in blind faith, as I did when my father was trying to teach me to ride a bike. And then, what happens as you garden is you attend and you see stuff. And then you get more so you can listen to the dirt and the plant. You can look at the plant and say, ooh, it's got a problem, and this is what I think the problem might be. That sort of a thing.
One of the things I love about gardening too is that after you've done it for a while and you kind of know what a plant looks like as distinguished from a weed, you learn a few rules for yourself.
Right.
Like weeds tend to be very hard to pull up, where plants are very vulnerable. So you get to know what is an authentic plant from a weed. And then once you know that, then sometimes a plant will just sort of volunteer someplace. The seed, some bird will drop a seed and this plant will start to come up, and you're pulling weeds and you see that and you think, no, that's a plant. I'm going to let that go and see what happens.
Yeah.
And then
right.
Something beautiful happens in that spot, right? Which you would never have chosen for yourself. And yet it just sort of arrives.
Yeah.
And that's part, I think, also of the leaning in and trusting.
Okay, I want to go back to something you said a little while ago about your painting process that I thought was amazing. So you start in on your canvas with what I would describe as half understanding. You use chaos, but you somehow are led to lay down colors and lines and da-da-da-da-da-da. And the whole time you are also entrusting yourself to that process and looking for the canvas to start to speak to you. So there's this active doing and this simultaneous submission to actually look to recognize a pattern. And I would just like to point out that that's right on. It's right on in all kinds of knowing, but it also, and this is what I've written about in my work that I get from years of thinking about Michael Polanyi, is this is an account of knowing that accredits half understanding, or what you might call anticipative knowing, and which is just what a clue is. I mean, if we all use the word clue, and by definition, a clue is a half understanding. At the point you solve the mystery, it's not a clue anymore. It's a subsidiary,
That whole clue aspect is exactly why I got to the point in my process of producing the chaos first, because it's for me, I mean, for other people, it may be easy, but for me, it was extraordinarily difficult to come up with anything that wasn't just leaden and half dead, starting from a white canvas. But if I start from a lot of color and something that I have to push against, that stands as a set of clues for me as to exactly where I'm going, then I can produce something that's got life to it and has some interest.
I would omit that word exactly, because there's a whole pile of wonderful mystery about this. And I don't think you're going for exactitude. What you're going for is the real, the lively real.
Yes, I don't know where I used the word exactly, but anyway, if I did, that's not what I meant. So,
well, and then, it's lovely too, when the pattern emerges, you have an aha moment, and then you realize you're done. I mean, that's the neat thing about how the creative act is like the process of discovery is, it's you don't know what the end is until the end shows up. And then you're also surprised. I love that line, surprising recognition. And I would say to the person who asked the question today that you started with, that's intoxicating about the real.
The surprising recognition?
Yeah. And it's like, it's been looking for you and speaking to you, and you matter to it. I don't know. There's just so much of the interpersonal encounter in the act of discovery or whatever. And there's nothing too small to make us really merry about discovery, Well,
I mean, one of the things that I've talked about quite a bit, and I think that you're on the same page, is that when you start thinking about the way the world lines up, truth and reality inhabit the same space. Goodness, truth, and beauty and reality all inhabit the same space. And that space is Christ, and that he is reality. So when the real comes looking for you, that's him coming looking for you, right? Yeah.
The thing is, and this is, I try to talk to everybody, and I think this happens whether you know Christ or not.
Oh, yes, absolutely, because he's looking for everybody.
Yes.
I mean, that's how you come to know. I mean, that the scripture says that it is his kindness that leads us to repentance. So it's that reaching out so one of the reasons I somebody talked to me about you was that in looking at Ian McGilchrist's work, when he talks about the two hemispheres of the brain, that the right hemisphere is attuned to the unknown and the left hemisphere is attuned only to what the right hemisphere gives it. So the right hemisphere brings in, anything from the unknown and brings it in, and then hands over some of that, all of it, whatever, hands it over to the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is good at processing and taking apart and putting back together and making things out of it. And the left hemisphere is very good at that thing. But in the ideal situation, the left hemisphere would take that accomplishment and hand it back to the right hemisphere for integrating, embodying, making it a part of who you are, rather than keeping it in this place where it's just disintegrated and atomized into little things, right? And so when I was listening to him talk, I was thinking about how it may well be the way that we're constituted and, the biology of our bodies, that it is the right hemisphere that is open to the real, that is open to this way of knowing, and that which can be known is always reaching out to us in a loving manner to have a relationship with us, because at bottom, when you take everything down to the bottom of physics, everything is relational. You can get all the way down to particle physics, and it's all relational. As far down as you go, there are three particles, and they're in relationship with each other.
Right.
Right. So, so it is that real seeking to be known by us that is always inviting this knowing process coming through the right hemisphere. And somehow with Descartes, we got clogged up in the left hemisphere.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the disintegrated idea. You know, I mean, Polanyi's critique of the modern West that was killing science was an ideal of explicit informational knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, he said, if that's knowledge, no scientific discovery could ever happen. And so what he gives us is this idea of subsidiarily indwelling to invite the real. And so I think what he gives us is what might be seen as a transformative way of your whole brain working together. You know, so you're even the most precise and careful things that you might do in the way of critical verification or whatever are things that you subsidiarily indwell to the end of inviting the real. Just like language. I mean, I'm sitting here uttering sentences, and nobody's thinking about the sentences. We're trying to get inside what they mean. You're trying to understand what I'm saying, right? So, that's any idea of kind of a disintegrated linear whatever doesn't even count as rationality. It's not knowledge. It's not knowledge. And all that our best efforts are actually made better by seeing them as subsidiarily indwelling them to invite reality to come.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we were to think about language as something that we have to take apart into the parts and then take it over to my side and put it back together again to try to make sense of it, we'd never get anywhere.
Right.
Right? Because what's happening is there's some sort of a relationship between your global thought and becoming indwelt into me, and then it's manifesting somehow in my global thought, and the two are marrying in some way, so that we get some sort. It's a very mysterious thing about how communication that it ever can happen, because we're both coming from such different worlds and different. You know, the library that's in your head is different than the library that's in my head, and all of your relationships and experiences are completely different than mine, and yet somehow the language that's coming from you can make some sort of sense to me, and that's that whole picture. And so the thing that McGilchrist says is that in his mind, the right hemisphere is actually supposed to be the master, and the left hemisphere, the emissary. But the emissary has taken over from the master. But I kind of see it a little bit differently. To me, there was meant to be a marriage there, and the marriage turned into a divorce.
Right.
And
well said.
Yes, it's not that they're unequal.
Right.
Not that the right hemisphere should be king and the left hemisphere should be just this little emissary that goes out, but there should be this relationship of love between the right and left hemisphere that would make this whole thing make sense inside our heads.
Yeah.
And that's what I see you doing with the epistemic therapy, is kind of doing marriage counseling.
That's lovely, Karen. I like that. Yeah.
So it'd be great to see you talk to Ian McGilchrist too, because I think you two would have a lot to talk about.
Master and emissary is kind of male.
Yeah. Have you by any chance run into his work?
I've read a little of it. Enough to, like an essay long synopsis. Enough.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. He did put out an essay long synopsis at one point, but it doesn't at all capture what he's getting at there, because he spends the first maybe 1/3 of the master and his emissary talking about the neuroscience that's behind his thesis. And then he spends about 2/3, well, maybe another, I don't know, 3/5 or something of the book talking about the way that this has played out through history in terms of philosophy and art and poetry. And that part is just, for me, it was a wonderful kind of traipse through history, because I did not have an education like yours where I learned philosophy and all of these things in college. And so I've come to this quite late in life. So it's good for me to kind of get these overviews of things so I can have an understanding of what's going on. Yeah. And then at the end, he sort of ties it together. But he's just recently written a new book, which is so long they had to put it into 2 volumes. It's called The Matter with Things, where he's laying out. Yeah. So you may have seen some of that, but
well, that's what that quote was from that I liked on Twitter. Somebody put a quote out there. I thought you picked that up on Twitter. But yeah, I'm curious about that book.
Yeah, I have the book. I haven't dived into it yet because every week I'm reading somebody else's book. And I was scheduled to talk to him last fall, but he got so busy in the weeks leading up to the publishing of the book that we had to ditch that, and I have not been able to get him back because now he's really busy. But his work is very interesting. Yeah. But getting back to epistemic therapy, when you are teaching students about this, what was the main way you tried to help them kind of wake up out of this Descartes or Cartesian slumber that they were in?
Well, teaching subsidiary focal integration is the thing that I think not just challenges, but actually easily dispels the Cartesian modernist defective epistemic ideal. You just spend some time. I always make everybody come up with a skill that they do easily, whether it's penmanship or driving a car or riding a bike, or, it's great if it has a tool that's involved, some sort of instrument. You can draw from any field in life and then get people to see how they're, the dimensions, the 3 sectors of clues, the normative, the situational, and the felt body, and then see the integrative aha moment and the indeterminate future possibility. I mean, you just lay those all out. You can identify them. I used to, when I taught the course, everybody had to do a covenant epistemology project where they entered into an act of a knowing venture and then had to identify all the covenant epistemology features in it that they could find, and those were transformative. And it's it's not like a secret gnosis. It's like we're doing it. We can't help but do this. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm doing is helping them to see in their own lives how it is that they're already carrying out subsidiary focal integration. And you spend a while thinking about your bike riding and you're kind of over Descartes. Now that's the short form. I mean, you got to work it out through all of your life. I mean, because all sorts of institutions, education for one, has drunk the Kool-Aid, we might say, of modernist epistemology. For one thing, it's, a modernist approach is commodifiable. If you want utility, and power. If you want, as the fathers of modernity said, mastery and control over nature, you want bits that you can, of transferable information that you can commodify. And that, you see, is going to do a number on reality. It really, I think it disavows and denudes, and that includes not just the reality out here, but the reality in here. So,
I
but
remember when I was.
It turns into a joyous enterprise, and in in a class, I mean, I've taught years of classes, and nobody did the same thing as far as their covenant epistemology. Okay, there were, sports ones and music ones and cooking ones, but everybody was doing something a little bit different. And for some, that course was absolutely transformative.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can totally see that because I used to teach art when I first started working. Well, when I first started kind of developing my creativity, I would say I had an opportunity to teach art to elementary school students for a couple of years. And that was quite transformative for me because you learn so much when you have to simplify something down to its bare minimum and then try to provide opportunities for others to soak that up at their level, because I was teaching all the way from kindergarten up through sixth grade. And I wanted each of them to have an experience with art that would be joyous, and but anyway, I would often have some kids say to me, "Oh, I can't draw, or I can't paint, or I can't do art," and because their first effort would be kind of clumsy or awkward. And I had certainly had that experience myself. I started painting when I was 50, and my first efforts were horribly clumsy and awkward, and I was completely tempted to give it up altogether because it's so embarrassing to be clumsy and awkward at the age of 50. But I had started gardening at the same time, and I got this sort of aha moment when I saw that the garden wasn't going to look like it ought to look for at least 3 years. And so I thought, well, I have to give painting at least 3 years then. But anyway, I would tell my students, well, see how you write your name? And they would say, yes. And I'd say, see how beautiful it is? And they'd be so proud of how they wrote their name because they were learning cursive, and then I'd say, what did it look like the first time you had to write your name? And then they'd kind of get this, oh, yeah. So it's doing something over and over and over and over again. That is where you start to develop these skills, right? And it gave them maybe the courage to try again, or the trusting to try again, that maybe there was some hope for the future. And I think that's the thing that we kind of lose in our world, because partly I think because we've become so everything has become so specified. And when you take a major in college, your major is refined down to, there are some people who study only the bioelectric communication between cells when they do their doctorate in biology, instead of the broad view. And because of that, we're all in our little silos. And so then we feel like when we look at somebody else coming out of their silo who's so expert at that we ought to be able to be expert at that too. And if we're not worthy of anything. So we just give up.
There's something else in what you mentioned too, and that is our modernist presumption about knowing is that it's instantaneously clear.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of there's not a timed sort of a thing about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's instantaneous. So that's I think what I am moving toward is where our modern milieu would have us think we've got either knowing or falling short.
Mm-hmm.
What we've got is knowing that's fraught with mystery and possibilities. So if you use the word indeterminate, as in indeterminate future manifestations, oh, that's a positive. That's a positive. It's filled with possibilities. It's not a lack. It's we can't, put it all, we can't, or somehow our knowledge is short. Oh no. And that's why I like the idea of the formative of action whatever that Jordan Peterson line was. And I've been thinking of a fish. We are embedded in the real the way the fish is in water, and it is our privilege to swim. And we're always orienting beyond, and we're so blessed that it's opening in possibilities. And, if you knew how to ski, I think I say this in Longing, why would you sit in the lodge? It just, you're not going to ski if you sit in the lodge. I have a young friend who actually helped produce the Audible for my 2 books so far, who was in my class, and he's a musician and he's a music producer. And he said to me just a couple months ago, if you know music, I can't imagine why you wouldn't create. I just think that's lovely. Karen, I'm going to have to go. My grandchildren are waiting for me.
Well, that's an indefinite future manifestation too. And you ended on the best note possible, always opening up to possibilities.
Yeah.
So
and learning to trust them. Learning to trust them. I actually think that, suffering, there's a trustworthiness about that too. Not that I wish it on anybody, but I think David Brooks writes about this, that in suffering, we can come to be reacquainted with ourselves and reconnected with the world in a way that is beyond what previously we thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes it's the suffering that can reconnect us with the real.
Well, and it certainly reconnects us in community with others if we're willing to open up about it, right? So
others are real.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Esther. It's been just grand.
You're welcome, Karen.
Have fun with your grandkitties.
Yeah, and you have fun with your canvases and chaos.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.